My name is Simone and I'm the neighborhood librarian here at Cliff Wright Library. So welcome everyone to Sustainability Speaker Series, and thank you for coming out again tonight. Please help yourself to, I believe there's some coffee, tea, and water in the kitchen area in the back. And after the presentation, we also ask anybody to come up to the front and ask questions, because there'll be lots of time at the end there. So before we get started here, we are gathered today on Treaty 6 territory in the homelands of the Métis. On behalf of the Saskatoon Public Library, we pay respect to the Indigenous ancestors of this place. As an organization that played an important role in the settlement of Saskatoon, and as a key memory institution, we acknowledge our responsibility to respond in meaningful ways to the calls of action. So the program tonight can only happen because of the partnership the library has with the Saskatchewan Environmental Society, who work hard to find knowledgeable speakers month after month. So I'm going to invite Nancy here from Saskatchewan Environmental Society to come up and introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. My name is Nancy Hooves, and I am a volunteer with the Saskatchewan Environmental Society. The Saskatchewan Environmental Society delivers community education and outreach, undertakes research, and carries out demonstration projects that move us towards sustainability. We have been operating since 1970 on important issues such as sustainable energy and climate solutions, water protection, biodiversity preservation, and reduction of toxic substances in our environment. If you aren't already a member, we encourage you to join. You can always find out more about our diverse projects, activities, and how to get involved by checking out our website at www.environmentalsociety.ca. For people who would like to receive email notifications of events in the Sustainability Speaker Series, there is a sign-up sheet at the table at the back of the room. Our speaker this evening is Renny Grilz, whom I first heard speak at a Meewasin sheep grazing demonstration in the Swale. And we were quite fascinated by the sheepdog and the shepherd working the sheep to go and eat the bushes out of the grass. And if you ever get a chance to go and see one of them, I highly recommend it. And then after Renny spoke, and I was very impressed by him as well. So I talked to him afterwards and asked him if he would come and speak in our series, and he said he would. So finally got that organized. Later, I learned that Renny is a professional agrologist and a seasoned prairie conservationist with over 30 years in prairie restoration and grassland management. He is also the resource management officer with the Meewasin Valley Authority, and leads initiatives in prescribed fire, targeted grazing, and invasive species control to enhance the health of native grasslands across Western Canada. And as a 2024 Nuffield Canada Contemporary Scholar, Renny's research focuses on building native seed networks and a native plant seed bank for Western Canada. His contributions to grassland conservation have earned him the Prairie Conservation Award and Distinguished Agrologist Award in 2023. Please help me welcome Renny Grilz.
Good evening. How's everyone this evening? A little bit warmer than last night? Yeah, I'm glad it's tonight, not yesterday. So I live out in Aberdeen, and I drove in yesterday in minus 50 wind chill, so it wasn't the funnest. So yeah, thank you very much for welcoming me tonight. I'm, as Nancy said, Renny Grilz. I'm the Resource Management Officer with Meewasin Valley Authority here in Saskatoon. And what I'm going to talk about today is about our prairie grasslands here in Western Canada and Saskatchewan specifically, and some of the work that's being done in the Saskatoon region on grassland management. And what I'm going to focus on is talking about prescribed fire as a land management tool to keep our grasslands healthy. So I've worked now for Meewasin for nearly 10 years here in Saskatoon, and Meewasin was created in 1979 as stewards of the South Saskatchewan River Valley. And it started with actually by members of the Saskatchewan Environmental Society and the Saskatoon Nature Society wanting to conserve and protect the South Saskatchewan River Valley through the city of Saskatoon and region. And we, as part of that advocacy work, and working with the city, the province, and the university to try and protect this river corridor, a plan was created by the late architect Raymond Murayama called the 100-year Meewasin Plan. And it was a visionary document that was published in 1979 to look at the conservation of the Saskatoon region, using the river valley as its backbone, and then the various conservation areas around the city. As when Meewasin was created, actually we're part of a legislative act of the Saskatchewan government, and when that act was created, it's provided lands owned by the City of Saskatoon, the Province of Saskatchewan, and the University of Saskatchewan. They also make up our Board of Governors as well. And so it's a quite unique model of governance, and actually one of the most unique governance models that we found in Canada in terms of conservation and land management. And those three participating parties make up our board, but they also provide the land base that we work with. But it also provides this unique partnership where we can have discussions with the province, the city, and the university to bring those connections together. And for myself, being part of the resource management or the stewardship team, working with those three entities to improve habitat, not just within the Saskatoon region, but work with those partners to improve their lands throughout the province as well. And within our mandate, we have a sort of a three-prong approach to our mandate. So myself, working in resource management, it's that conservation of the river valley and these natural areas around Saskatoon, provide educational opportunities to the public and an understanding of that river valley. One of our flagship sites is Beaver Creek Conservation Area. I think a lot of people have been there to feed the chickadees, especially in the wintertime, but also to educate along the river valley with our signage, interpretive programs, and our tourism programs. And then our development branch is looking at not just creating that trail network that we all love here in Saskatoon. It's now 107 kilometers long, and provides access to the river valley in these natural spaces, but it also, as part of our mandate and through our act, we actually regulate development within the river valley as well. And so the Meewasin Valley Act actually supersedes numerous acts within the Saskatchewan government, including the Municipalities Act. And so we provide that sort of that sober second thought of some of these development projects. Now, the one challenge is we do have representatives from the province, city, and university, but when you have all three partners coming together to talk, that allows for that discussion to happen. But also, it also allows for unique perspectives to occur within that development. And so it's a quite interesting model, and something that we've looked across Canada, and we can't find any other organization as unique as us. Our jurisdiction covers roughly 67 square kilometers, roughly 6,700 hectares of land within the city of Saskatoon and the Arm-McCormick Park. 60% of our jurisdiction falls within the city limits, including majority of the University of Saskatchewan campus and a lot of those riverside parks. And then outside of the city, within the whole boundary of Arm-McCormick Park, from south end to the north end. And we cover approximately 90 kilometers of the river valley. Back in 2022, we worked with the federal government as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the agreement that was signed in Montreal back in 2022, looking at the Global Biodiversity Framework. They were looking at a series of protected areas across Canada to count towards the goal of conserving 30% of Canada's natural landscape by 2030. And so we started working with the federal government to add multiple sites within our jurisdiction, and sites that we manage or work with the city of Saskatoon or the university to incorporate into these protected areas, and something else called other effective area-based conservation measures. So protected areas, typically a person thinks of a protected area as something like a national park or a provincial park, or maybe a site owned by the Nature Conservancy of Canada or Ducks Unlimited. So those are typically our protected areas across Canada. What's unique, though, is we were one of the first jurisdictions to look at applying this within an urban landscape and working with Environment Canada on that classification. And so we actually incorporated sites like Saskatoon Natural Grasslands as a protected area within the city limits of Saskatoon. It's a site that's owned by Meewasin. It was donated to, or sold to Meewasin for $1 back in the 1990s by the city of Saskatoon. And it's actually recognized as a protected area within the city of Saskatoon, which is quite unique to have these protected areas. But also we tested the other effective conservation measures on sites, including many of our riverside parks within the city. And so it's a unique model to look at this. A lot of these OACM lands are usually large landscapes in northern Canada that have traditional hunting and trapping rights. And to look at some of these urban landscapes as part of these protected areas was quite unique. This measure is, we are looking at additional sites within the city limits. I think a few people like Sarah, my friend Sarah there, will notice that the Northeast Swale is not included at this time. And we're working with the city of Saskatoon to incorporate some of these other sites into that protected area status. So I'm going to shift gears to look at our grasslands worldwide. So this is a map of our worldwide grasslands. And grasslands actually occupy 40% of our global landscape throughout almost every continent on the earth except for Antarctica. From Australia to the Sahara of Africa to the steppes of Europe and in through Russia. And then areas like the Pantanal in Brazil and Argentina down through Chile. And then our North American grasslands cover from pretty much north of Edmonton all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And so it's a really worldwide large area of these ecosystems that are too hot and too dry for forests and too wet and too cold for deserts. And so they make a very unique landscape. And however, there also are quite often the breadbaskets and the food source around the world as well. And grasslands are actually some of the most endangered ecosystems in the world, throughout the world. You think of areas like throughout Europe, many of those grasslands are now lost due to urban expansion and agriculture. So why do grasslands matter? So with grasslands, there's multiple uses for these valuable ecosystems. Myself, I'm quite involved with an organization called the Society for Range Management, which looks at managing our native grasslands of North America, both from a livestock production perspective and a healthy perspective for managing for livestock, but also for other goods and services as well. And so, when we think of grasslands, we think of rangelands, we think of the open prairie where cattle are grazing. But also they're very critical for water management, where when it rains, when it snows, that water comes onto this landscape and acts as that sponge on that landscape. And quite often when you have intact grasslands, you still have your intact wetland ecosystems with it. They're very important for wildlife habitat and our biodiversity. They create that aesthetic value. Who's been down to Grasslands National Park in the room? Yeah, so about a third of the room. Yeah, very bleak, could be bleak landscape if you're not into grasslands, but it's also a very aesthetically beautiful ecosystem as well. And quite often we forget about how beautiful these grassland systems can be. The recreational use of these systems for hiking and camping and other uses. The importance of carbon sequestration. And some of the research that's coming out right now is showing that a third of the world's carbon is actually stored and locked away in our grasslands. And when you think of a grassland system, the amount of the plants above the surface is only 1/7 of what's underground. And so that root system traps and stores all that carbon. So when a fire comes through or an animal comes through and grazes off that grass, it's a minimal amount of carbon that's released because the majority of the carbon is stored underground, and it's that long-term storage of our carbon. And some research that's done in Alberta estimates that in the dry part of southern Alberta, so that Brooks country in southern Alberta, 60 tons per hectare of carbon are stored in grassland pasture systems. It works out to roughly, across Alberta, they estimate there's about 10 million acres of grasslands. Roughly 237 million tons of carbon are stored in Alberta's grasslands alone. So it's a huge carbon sink in those ecosystems. And when you put a dollar value on that carbon, it's worth about $3 billion in Alberta of that carbon stored in those grasslands. And when we think about carbon storage, we think of the forests, right? And we think of the Amazon rainforest, we think of the boreal forest, but we forget about the importance of our grasslands. And so when we lose our grasslands to cultivation, to urban expansion, we release that carbon into that atmosphere and we cannot get it back into that storage. And the work that we do from an agriculture perspective, we're able to increase the amount of carbon within proper cropping systems, but we can't quite get that amount of carbon back to what we have lost that these grasslands have built over 10,000 years. And then other ecological goods and services and the value of those grasslands. So this is some work that was done by the Native Plant Society in 1990 using, back in the late 1990s, using imagery from the 1990s, looking at the tracts of grassland left in Saskatchewan. So you can see, southwestern Saskatchewan, the Cypress Hills. I got to walk over there. The Cypress Hills and Grasslands National Park, Cypress Hills, Battle Creek Community Pasture. This is Lake Diefenbaker. This is a series of large community pastures. Then you get up to Saskatoon, right about there. So actually, we have actually, at that time it was estimated that there was 20% of our grasslands left in Saskatchewan. And definitely more on the western side of the province. When you got to the eastern side of the province, there was more aspen forest, and then also a lot, not incorporated into this calculation, but definitely in the western side of the province. In 2018 or 2015, imagery was used and research was done by some researchers in 2018, going back and looking at satellite imagery from 2015 imagery to look at what's left of our grasslands. So if you take a look at, that's 1990 imagery, and there was roughly 41,000 square kilometers of native grasslands left in Saskatchewan. And by 2015, we were down to 33,000 square kilometers of grassland. And you can just see these areas slowly being chipped away. And so this is actually fairly old data. This is 10-year-old data. And so you've seen a lot of loss. And this map shows the amount of grassland lost, roughly 13,000 square kilometers of grasslands within that 15-year period. This research there hasn't been any follow-up research on this, but I would argue that we've probably lost even more than this in the last 10 years. The 2015 estimate that there was about 14% of our native grasslands remaining in Saskatchewan. And now I think with the high value of cropland and also the advances in equipment, and high commodity prices, I would speculate that we've lost even more land, probably pushing that 12 to 11%. So it is a very imperiled ecosystem. And so when you think about our ecosystems around the world, our grasslands are the most imperiled ecosystem in the world. I was in Brazil last March as part of my Nuffel Canada project. And we were in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul, and we met with the state governor. Part of that state has the Pantanal wetlands, which is the largest inland wetland ecosystem in the world, and also they contain a part of the Amazon rainforest. Within the Amazon rainforest, within Brazil, with the current government of Brazil, we have to realize within the current government of Brazil, 80% of their Amazon rainforest is protected. Here in Saskatchewan, the estimate is less than 1% of our grasslands are protected. So, our grassland ecosystems are at high risk here. But it's also not just at risk to the plow or to urban expansion. It's also at risk for other issues like movement of trees and forests into our grasslands, invasive species. It could be anything from leafy spurge to large flowering plants, to also invasive grass species as well. So when you think of our grassland ecosystems, they evolved over the last 10,000 years since glaciation of different ecosystem drivers to help form and build the soils, build those vegetation communities as these glaciers retreated. And so it was a combination of our climate, so those drought periods, those wet periods, those hot temperatures, those cold temperatures, and the climate variation that we had over the last 10,000 years. And when you look at our grasslands within Saskatchewan, the grasslands around the Saskatoon region are a lot different than the grasslands in Swift Current. And that's that difference in that local climate. But they help shape those grasslands. Grazing. When you look back at the historical records of pre-colonization here in Western North America, there was estimates of anywhere between 60 to 100 million bison roaming from Texas all the way north of Edmonton. And those animals would have roamed across these landscapes and would have had a major impact from a grazing and management, from a grazing disturbance on that landscape. So there would have been small family pods of 10 to 12, 20 animals to large herds, from thousands to hundreds of thousands moving through an area. So when you think of like 10,000 bison roaming through an area, the amount of disturbance they would have created, they would have churned that soil, they would have defecated and left manure everywhere, they would have rolled in that, and created those buffalo wallows and would have churned up that soil. So that was, but also just the grazing pressure that they created. Also, they may have not returned to a certain area for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, just depending on their movement patterns of those herds. There would have been other grazers, everything from gophers to elk to deer to other species, and that would have shaped our grasslands as well. And so grazing is a natural part of our ecosystem. And so we remove some of these drivers out of our systems, they begin to collapse. And then fire. Fire was actually a really critical component of our grasslands, especially in this part of North America. And our grasslands would have had natural burn cycles. And these fires would have either occurred caused by lightnings, by dry lightning storms in the summertime, say in July when we get no rain, but you have these intense lightning systems that cause fires on the hilltops, to also fires started by Indigenous peoples. These fires would have been done through intentional purposes, so for using it for clearing an area, for setting an area, lighting it on fire and attracting the bison to graze because they would come to that new green area. They would have used it for warfare, and they would have also for cleaning up camping areas as well. And some of the work we've been doing with Meewasin, we've been talking with some of the elders and learning some of their stories about the use of fire. And some of the research that's coming out throughout North America is fire was actually a really critical tool used by our Indigenous peoples throughout the Great Plains from Texas all the way through here as a land management tool to help shape these grassland systems and as a land management tool. When colonization and the settlers started coming into Western Canada, we had that fear of fire. And and just imagine if you were a pioneer, you moved onto the prairies, you lived in a sod house made of grass. Your whole livelihood was based on your crops and your cattle herd on a small parcel of land and that high risk of fire. So we had 150 years of fire suppression in these prairie ecosystems. And it's the very same story that we're seeing in our boreal forest ecosystems as well, is that 150 years of fire suppression and removing these fire adapted communities, removing fire from those systems. So if you look at our those three main ecosystem drivers, grazing and fire and climate is a sort of a constant. You got your droughts and you got your wet cycles. But if you remove grazing and fire from these ecosystems, you remove one, it'll still function, but you might see some shifts. But if you remove both of those from that system, you can see a collapse. And so that's why using these different land management tools to keep these grasslands healthy is very important. Here in the Saskatoon region, some of the research done at the University of Saskatchewan has shown that fires would have naturally occurred within this ecosystem on a 7 to a 15-year cycle. That's based on the amount of vegetation that regrows after fire and calculating some flood, wet cycles, dry cycles, and also grazing. If you go down south of Winnipeg, the tall grass prairie, their vegetation grows, waist high, the grasses there. It's a totally different species of grasses in that area, higher moisture and warmer temperatures. And when you think of like the corn belt of Iowa, that's tall grass prairie through there. And so that fire return interval was about 1 every 5 years because of the amount of vegetation growth on that landscape, and that fire return interval would have occurred more often. If you go into southwestern Saskatchewan, it probably would have been a longer term cycle, 15 to 30 year cycle. And then there's actually been some research done in south of Calgary in the Porcupine Hills. So this is a foothills fescue grassland ecosystem. So if you think in that Okotoks country south of Calgary, looking at tree ring analysis, it's suggesting that a natural fire return interval was every 16 to 22 years. So probably very similar to the Cypress Hills as well, would have been a very similar fire cycle as well. So fire was a natural part of the system. So if you remove it from the system, you see some shifts occurring in those grasslands. So I'm going to shift to a couple of different sites here in the Saskatoon region. So this one's the Northeast Swale, located northeast part of Saskatoon. The community on the east side of the Swale is Aspen Ridge. To the south is Evergreen. Who's ever been to the Northeast Swale? Max, I know you've been there. I'm calling you out, Max, sorry. And so, very unique landscape within the city limits of Saskatoon. A 300 hectare grassland, wetland ecosystem within the city limits. Meewasin's had the opportunity to manage this site on behalf of the city of Saskatoon for the last 15 years. And the work that we've been doing with ourselves, our volunteers, and also other groups like the Swale Watchers and Well About Saskatoon, going out and monitoring this site and learning about this site, we're finding a whole suite of endangered and rare species use this ecosystem within our city limits for these grasslands for their habitat. And so birds, historically, we actually had burrowing owls in the Saskatoon region. Their population has declined and the range has shifted. They're no longer seen in the Saskatoon region, but we have records for burrowing owls in the early 1980s at the Northeast Swale. Birds like the Sprague's pipit, loggerhead shrike, bobolink, short-eared owl have all been seen at the Northeast Swale within the last 10 years, and quite a few of these species we see on an annual basis. Or if we don't see them, we record them with bird surveys and other equipment. We have northern leopard frogs, which are a grassland, which are actually a wetland-dependent species, but also use grasslands for foraging in the summer months. We have mammals like little brown bat and badger that use these grasslands. And then rare plants as well, like the infamous crowfoot violet, which we find along the ridges at the Northeast Swale. South of the city, so that the prairie at at the Northeast Swale it's a heavy clay soil, and so it's a grassland system that's dominated by, historically would have been by wheatgrasses and spear grasses and fescue, and that would have been sort of the dominant communities in those areas. However, with the shift with invasive species coming in, we've seen some of those shifts away from that. When we go south of the city, to Beaver Creek and Cranberry Flats, who's been to those sites? Okay, quite more people there, which is great. So these are sandy sites, and these are actually stabilized sand dune sites in a lot of those areas in those grasslands. And they have a different species of grass, more sand-dependent species, but also sometimes a different species, some different species of species at risk as well that we wouldn't find at the Northeast Swale. And so at Cranberry Flats, we have a species called, I didn't get the full name, Gibson's big sand tiger beetle, which is found at Cranberry Flats. And it was actually members of the Saskatchewan Nature Society that discovered that population for us, so thank you very much. And then we have also smooth goosefoot, located at Beaver Creek Conservation Area. And so these are two endangered, one's threatened beetle, and the other one's in the threatened plant that are found at these sites, and which is very, very unique for our part, this part of, and actually some of the most northern populations for these two species. So after we discovered Gibson's big sand tiger beetle at Beaver Creek, Cranberry Flats, sorry. Environment Canada did a recovery plan for this species and identified Cranberry Flats as critical habitat for Gibson's big sand tiger beetle. And so within the recovery strategy for this species, they actually recommend the destabilization of sand dunes to allow for the species, because the Gibsons requires open sand to burrow into the sand, and that's their critical habitat. And so over time, these grasslands become stabilized with shrubs growing on them, more grasses, and it decreases the habitat availability for that species. So the recovery plan is actually more fire and grazing is the recommendation for improving the habitat for this species. The map that we're showing there is there's a green dot right there. That's the known location where we constantly see the sand beetle, and the entire site falls within the critical habitat zone for the site. The map shows areas that we've burnt at Beaver Creek, or at Cranberry Flats, over the last 15 years. We haven't done any burns in the last few years, but we have plans to do additional prescribed fires in the area. And however, unfortunately, we haven't done any grazing on this site because of concerns with the public on the site and the amount of dogs on the site. So we haven't done any grazing. But our fire is a critical management tool for this beetle, and I'll talk more about that. I'm going to back up to Northeast Swale. What I didn't mention with this map is this map is actually showing the areas that we've grazed and burnt from 2007 to 2023. So the map isn't updated with our current grazing and our burning areas, but it shows that overlay of that mosaic of different management tools that we're using on that landscape. So we're actually using grazing and fire together as a land management tool to enhance the habitat for the species on the site. And I'll talk more about that later. And then I mentioned the smooth goosefoot, which is actually an annual rare plant. It's actually a threatened plant, and what it requires is when it goes to seed, the seed falls on the sand. The shifting sand is the habitat where the seed germinates, but also that shifting sand scarifies that seed to increase the germination of that seed. And it really likes depressional sand dunes that are exposed sand. And so we've been targeting some of our grazing programs and our prescribed fire programs to try and destabilize these sand dunes. What's funny is my predecessor at Meewasin, Luke Delaney, he had been in the job as resource management officer for 32 years. He spent 32 years trying to stabilize these sand dunes. Now I've been trying to spend the last 10 years trying to destabilize the sand dunes. And that's the difference in understanding how these grassland ecosystems work. When I first started my career in grassland management, the mantra was anything to stop the sand from shifting. And now, as we're looking at this multi-species approach and multi-ecosystem services approach, actually this shifting sand is not a bad thing. And so, so we're actually just sort of shifting our philosophy a little bit. This map shows the areas that we've been burning and grazing at the Northeast Swale, getting all the sites mixed up. Beaver Creek Conservation Area, 2023, back about 7 years. And you can see sort of that mosaic of different sites. Also, you can see some of these big, large burn areas that we're doing as well, and trying to create these big, large burn patches as well on that landscape. What's missing on the map is my 2024 burn from this last fall, where we burned this entire area out here. So just a little bit of a close-up of the north side of Beaver Creek. When you first drive into Beaver Creek, and there's the road, and this is the north side of that. And this sand dune right here is the critical habitat for smooth goosefoot. And we have historical records in this sand dune of smooth goosefoot as well. And so we're trying to do some active management to try and destabilize those sand dunes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So when you're trying to manage these grasslands, you can manage them for different perspectives and different goals and objectives. You can manage it for a very targeted species. You can manage them for grassland health, and there's certain indicators that you'd be managing for health. You could be managing for one species at risk. You could be managing it for a suite of species at risk. Or you could be just managing it for its beauty and trying to control invasive species. So when you're a landowner or a land steward, you have different objectives that you can look at for when you're managing your grassland systems. When you're managing from a species at risk perspective, each species at risk has its unique ecosystem characteristics that it's looking for, certain habitat characteristics that it's looking for. So for this example, this is a loggerhead shrike. So a loggerhead shrike is also known as the butcher bird. So if you've ever been hiking and you see along a fence line, there is either a garter snake or a mouse, or in some cases a grasshopper impaled on the side of a fence, like on the barbs of a fence. That is because the butcher bird or the loggerhead shrike. So what they do is they catch their prey with its long beak, they catch it and they place it on the spike, and then they come back and forage on it later on. And that's, its hunting method. So the characteristics that species is looking for, they're okay with habitat that has fences and barbed wire and fence posts. They're okay with some shrubs, and especially that's where they nest. They don't nest on the grass, but they'll nest in the trees and shrubs, especially those thorny bushes like thorny buffalo berry. They like, from a grassland management perspective, they like variable height. So some grazing's good, but not too much grazing. They like sort of that Goldilocks of grass height. They don't like dense forested areas or shrub areas. And also road areas where there's high risk of collisions, they try and avoid as well. So as a land manager, if I'm targeting loggerhead shrike or trying to restore a site for loggerhead shrike habitat, I would try and look for some of that variable height grasses. I'd probably plant some shrubs like thorny buffalo berry to get that habitat created, and to create that unique habitat for that species. A different species, the Sprague's pipit. It's a little brown bird that if you're into grassland birds, you've probably never seen, but you've heard. Quite often they fly really high up in the sky and they have a distinct call. These bird species require larger grassland tracts, about minimum 160 acres, a quarter section of land or more. It requires grass that's not too tall, ideally medium height. They try and avoid trees and shrubs. They avoid grasslands that actually have too much dead grass material underneath. So our grasslands, when it produces all that top vegetation, and then the fall it dies back and it builds up that litter. It's called litter. And so if it gets too much litter, that dead grass material, the birds don't use it for nesting, or it's too difficult to forage. And so they tend to avoid those areas as well. So they really like a moderately grazed site or moderate disturbed site with a little bit of shrubs but not too many, and with wide open grasslands. So if your target is to manage for that species, it's a little bit different than a loggerhead shrike. Then if you're trying to manage for a short-eared owl, which is an owl that stays around throughout the winter. Quite often at this time of year, if you're out at the northeast swell, you might actually see them flying along, and they have a unique flying pattern along the grasslands, looking for rodents to eat. They avoid wooded areas. They like that medium height grass area and a little bit of light grazing. They like to be near water bodies as well. So, northeast swell, I think there's a lot of good wetlands nearby for hunting. And then also they stay away from power poles and roads as well. And so they also don't want disturbance during that main foraging and nesting period as well. So another little bit different than the other bird species. Then you get something like the northern leopard frog, which is actually a special species of concern. And this species actually requires 3 different types of habitat throughout its life cycle. So in the spring, they look for ponds They use ponds where they lay their eggs and they emerge from. And then they move out of those ponds into the grassland throughout the summer months for foraging. And if you, sometimes I've seen them at Cranberry Flats Conservation Area as far up as the parking lot. You see these big northern leopard frogs, and so the nearest water body for them is the river. So it's they'll travel up to 1 kilometer away for water. And then in the winter, before winter sets in, they try and find water bodies that either springs or deep water bodies where they can have water flowing over them when they bury themselves into the mud. So quite often along the river valley, where we find them is where there's active springs water coming out of these springs into the river. And quite often at the end of August, you'll see all of a sudden 100 northern leopard frogs bunched up in a small area along the riverbank. And so these, you have to manage all different habitats for this type of species. So, is that working? You got a little video in there. There we go. So this was a prescribed fire we did at Beaver Creek Conservation Area in fall of 2023 in that sand dune for smooth goosefoot. And so on this prescribed fire, we did 40 acres of grassland. And we worked we had multiple partners joining us on that day to do this burn. And our primary target was to this sand dune in the middle, this big bowl, try and burn out all the vegetation in that site. So we had creeping juniper was covering the slopes and with grasses interspersed with it. And our goal was to reduce that creeping juniper cover and open up that sand dune. And so I was flying the drone during this situation. So what we were trying as our management objective for this site, for this prescribed fire, was sort of a four-prong approach. So our first objective was to enhance the habitat for the smooth goosefoot and reduce the creeping juniper and grass cover within that sand dune. The second objective was within that larger grassland area to reduce the amount of shrubs. So we're starting to see an increase in western snowberry, wolf willow, and a few other native shrub species. And what happens in our grassland systems, especially in our Saskatoon region, as we reduce our disturbance, so we have less grazing and less fire, we see an increase in shrub. And so fire is one of those ways to reduce that shrub cover. And so we were trying to reduce that shrub cover. We also started seeing an accumulation of litter. And you remember back to the Sprague's pipit, they don't like too much litter. And so we want to reduce some of that litter cover. And then number 4, we want to actually reduce the fire risk on this site. As you can see, that you can see a bit of a trail. So that's actually part of the hiking trail through Beaver Creek Conservation Area in our North Prairie. My concern was that someone would eventually start a fire in that area. And then on a day when we did, where it was high winds, low humidity, and high fire risk. And so it's to reduce some of that fire risk on that site as well. So this is about 10 minutes after the fire went through that sand dune. This one doesn't have a one. But yeah, this is that sand dune. This is about 20 minutes after that fire. So you can see that ash within that sand dune. And so that is the burnt creeping juniper. We got a really hot fire going in there. And we reduced a lot of that shrub cover and a lot of those grasses. So we did smooth goosefoot surveys we've been working with Environment Canada for the last 10 years doing smooth goosefoot surveys. So in 2021 we did a survey, we found I think it was about 8 plants. 2022 we did a survey in that sand dune and we only found 3 plants. Went in 2023, 0 plants. 2024 we went in, so this is this would have been in August of 2024. We burnt it in October of 2023. We found 18 plants. So we've seen a marked, a tremendous increase in the smooth goosefoot post-fire. So, and we also found smooth goosefoot in new areas that we hadn't found them before and within the sand dune. So it's a combination of probably not just the fire, but also that increased moisture that we had in the spring probably helped with the seedling germination as well. But we saw a positive impact from the fire on smooth goosefoot. Very nondescript plant. I don't go out and do the surveys. I send summer students out to go with Candace Neufeld with Environment Canada to go look at them because I could never find them because it's so nondescript. So this is a different spot, not that far away. A site that it's a low sand dune at Beaver Creek, just north of our parking lot area. And so this was a sand dune that we were trying to reduce some western snowberry cover, to try and expose some sand as well. And I also think on this site we don't have records of Gibson's big sand tiger beetle, but we have other tiger beetles on this site. So I'm speculating we probably have Gibson's on this site, we just haven't found it yet. And so I wanted to try and create some disturbed sand dunes. This site also, that is Plains rafescue, which is a rare grass, which is actually a very characteristic grass. When you think of prairie wool, that was the species, when people talk about the prairie wool, that was the species that people talk about. And it was actually one of the dominant grasses in the Saskatoon region. And so we had it flowering right after the burn. So a very unique response post-fire. You can see that bare area that we created by that removal of that creeping juniper, those dead stems, or those dead branches in there, that's that creeping juniper that we removed with the fire. So one of the things that we also do is we incorporate our sheep grazing into our programs as well. And so this is that burnt area that I showed before. This is actually with the sheep grazing in September of 2023. And what we were targeting with the sheep grazing is to go in after the fire and graze any shrubs that are coming up and emerging. So quite often fire will not kill a shrub like wolf willow or western snowberry. It'll cause it to resprout. And so then you have to do some other control methods if you want to try and reduce that shrub cover. And so one of the things that we're working on is with working with our shepherd, Jared Epp, using his sheep to try and see if we can have an impact on that shrub species. And so what we find, so this is actually, this is Labor Day Monday, and we released the sheep that hour at noon. And then what we noticed within the first hour, the sheep are going straight to the wolf willow, which is a native shrub that grows about this tall, has a gray, silvery color. Well, it can get actually about this tall. And they were going straight to those young sprouts and targeting them for grazing. And so we were finding that they're actually that 1-2 punch of fire followed by the sheep grazing, we're actually noticing an impact, a positive impact for our target of controlling that shrub species. Then we noticed the sheep started moving in. I'm going to bring back the back. Okay, we'll go back to there. And then what we noticed is then after they started targeting the wolf willow, they started putting themselves in the bottom of those sand pits and those blowouts, and started going after the grasses that were growing in those blowouts, and started managing that. So it's interesting. You could do learning and watching that animal behavior of what the sheep will target after certain conditions. If we wouldn't have burnt this area and we would have stuck the sheep in there, they wouldn't have touched the wolf willow. They probably wouldn't have gone into that sand dune. They probably would have went more into the uplands and targeted their grazing there. So we're seeing an impact from that sheep grazing. And we're doing similar work at the Northeast Swale as well with our targeted impact of fire and grazing. This was a burn that we did in October of 2022 at Wanuskewin Heritage Park. So this is across the creek from their interpretive center, about a 9-acre burn overlooking Opimok Creek and then the South Saskatchewan River. That was May 13th. Look how much it greened up. If you look at it, you wouldn't even know that it would have burned. Those little rings that you see, that was actually junipers that were forming, that create these large, big rings in those grasslands. And within that site as well, there was numerous heritage sites, including a large bison rubbing stone as well. And one of the things that we noticed after we burnt, a lot of animals started moving into this area. The deer, jackrabbits, and other species were going in there and starting to browse around in that landscape. This patch here hadn't been grazed or burnt in probably over 30 years. And so Ian Hanowich is the resource management manager over at Saskatchewan, and his goal is to burn this again in the next year or two and work with us on that. So this is the Northeast Swale. So we burnt this in October, 2 days after, so it was October 16th. It's a ridge at the Northeast Swale where we take a lot of our tours out onto that site. So we burnt that ridge, went out on May 22nd, and you can see how it greened up. Beautiful, lush green. On that top of that, it's a rocky ridge with a lot of rocks. And what was interesting is you found all these rock exposures, right? You knew the rocks were there, but as soon as you burnt the vegetation over, you found more rocks. We started finding some fossils in the rocks as well. And then a couple of weeks later, at the end of May, there's a plant, a rare plant out there called crowfoot violet. And it's an S3 rare plant, and it's a beautiful purple flower on this plant with beautiful leaves on it. And we worked with the Saskatoon Nature Society in a volunteer event with Meewasin, and we did surveys on this rocky ridge. And I brought 200 pin flags, thinking, okay, that's about, we'll find about 200 patches of this. Well, the 200 pin flags, we only hit this far on the ridge. We found so many crowfoot violets, and they responded to that fire. So it was the good moisture in the spring, and then that fire opened up that site to bring on the crowfoot violet. And what we're finding is this crowfoot violet, we're finding in other sites around Saskatoon, including the small swale as well. And Sarah Bryson here with the Saskatoon Nature Society, avid plant nerd, I'll call her a plant nerd. And she's been doing a lot of these surveys in the region, looking for this species for us. And it's a very important species because it's one that, after the crocuses flower, it's the next one that flowers. And so they're one of the next ones that flowers, so very important from a pollinator perspective on our grasslands. And it's also a rare plant. But just seeing that response post-fire was quite phenomenal. So I want to talk about how we're getting this fire on this landscape. So back in 2021, I'll back up. Back in the late 1980s, Dr. Jim Romo came to Saskatoon to the University of Saskatchewan Plant Ecology Department, coming from the United States, where they had, had been using fire as a land management tool for quite a few decades. And so he started managing a site that the university owns on the east side of the city called Curtin Prairie, and using fire as a land management tool. He then started working with Meewasin Valley Authority, and then also Environment Canada at St. Denis National Wildlife Area, and also Last Mountain Lake National Wildlife Area, to start using fire as a land management tool back into our grassland systems. Historically, a lot of land managers were using fire as a tool to manage these grasslands in the 50s and the 60s, but just sort of fell out of favor. And so within the Saskatoon region, we have been using fire for the last 40 years for managing our grassland systems. One of the things that we were finding, though, is other parts of the Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta were having a hard time getting their fire programs up and running. There was a really active fire program in Manitoba, south of Winnipeg in the Tallgrass Prairie, and within the city of Winnipeg as well. But other jurisdictions were interested in using fire as a management tool. And so we were approached by the Weston Family Foundation to create an organization called the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange. And Meewasin is the holder of this organization. And I have a team that works with me with this organization, where we're trying to train people on how to use fire safely in the landscape as a land management tool. Every year we host a training event here in Saskatoon called the Training Exchange. And so this year was our 3rd year, where we brought people from all across Western Canada, and we brought 3 trainers in from the United States to train us how to apply safe fire on the landscape in a good way. The gentleman in black there by the logo, his name's Cody Wohlers, and he's from Iowa, and he's been a mentor for myself on prescribed fire. And you know, in the last 3 years, we've moved ourselves from burning small patches the size of this room, which I would probably lose sleep for 2 nights or beforehand to burn this, to now burning 40 acres at a time. And building ourselves up with training, resources, and knowledge, and then expanding and sharing that with people around Western Canada. And we're seeing interest in fire throughout, you know, the prairies, you know, from Lethbridge to Porcupine Hills to Vermilion, Alberta into Manitoba. And so just building that capacity to do fire. And it's been a really successful story. One of the challenges, though, that we found is one of our biggest, you know, we have a couple limiting factors, is access to training, access to equipment, but also that insurance piece as well. And as you can imagine, you know, when you see Los Angeles burning down or Fort McMurray or Jasper burning down, insurance becomes a major issue. And so that's one thing that we're still trying to figure out, is reducing that insurance liability risk for landowners and producers. Ourselves at Meewasin, we pay dearly for our prescribed fire insurance every year to reduce that. You know, actually, but our insurance premiums over the last 3 years have dropped because of our training and our equipment and our proven track record, which is surprising considering what's happening in the world. So it's been a really exciting time with this prescribed fire exchange. And within the fire exchange, it's providing that training to get people better skilled and better knowledge of using fire, help conduct prescribed fires, and this is not necessarily going out and doing the burns for people, but helping those resources to get there, you know, whether it's equipment or training guides or advice and guidance. And quite often, and most of the time, this is with agencies that we're working with, because they have the staffing capacity and the insurance capacity. And then also working with the researchers on doing that fire science and building that monitoring programs. And so one of my colleagues, Dr. Roy Vera, with the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange, he's actually doing the research on seeing what are the impacts of fire. You know, the pretty pictures look great, that, oh, this is great, look at that lovely fire, look at that green growth. But actually, are we meeting our management objectives? And what are the negative impacts and what are the positive impacts of the fire that we're having? Some of the research that he's been doing with Dr. Eric Lamb with the University of Saskatchewan is showing actually post-fire, the grasses green up, the production isn't as high as pre-fire, but actually the nutrient content of the grass is higher. So if you factor the nutrient content being higher and production lower, your cattle gains are actually about the same as pre-fire. So it's, you know, some pretty phenomenal research that we're doing with this. And then we're also looking at the impacts of fire on shrub control and invasive species control. So our grasslands evolved under these natural processes of our climate, the droughts, the cold, the heat, you know, the dry, you know, and all those stresses that our climate provides. You know, minus 50 wind chill one day to minus 2 the next day. But then also they evolved under fire and grazing. And so if we remove grazing from that landscape, we're going to see a shift happening, you know, to these grasslands. If we remove fire from the landscape, we're going to see a shift. And we've seen this with our long-term monitoring across Western Canada and across North America, that we've seen these shifts in these grassland communities because of these lack of these natural disturbances. And so we can use those tools to help manage these grasslands to create these unique heterogeneity, these patches for biodiversity, for habitat, and also to restore grassland health and its functionality. Also, managing, if you're targeting specific species at risk or specific biodiversity qualities, you can use these tools to meet those habitat requirements. And actually, there's other tools you can use as well. But you could use these different tools to manage these grasslands to meet those habitat requirements for those species. So So with that, thank you very much.